There are certain mornings in Oxford when even the pigeons seem unwilling to break the silence. That particular dawn, the bells of St. Fridswide's took their time finding a rhythm, their sound half swallowed by a mist that clung to the cobbles like an old memory. I remember standing outside the chapel, listening to the faint tremor of a choir rehearsing inside. A boy's voice, pure and wavering, carried through the cracks in the door. It was not so much a hymn as an echo of loss, perhaps, or something older still. I was not supposed to be there. My presence was a courtesy to the dean, who disliked publicity and the scent of scandal almost as much as he disliked the idea of police officers near the altar. Yet a young chorister had gone missing after evensong 2 nights before, and even in Oxford, innocence has a tendency to disappear quietly. Lewis had gone inside to speak with the verger. I stayed on the steps, half listening, half dreaming, aware of how every case begins the same way with a faint discomfort one cannot yet name. The sun had not yet burned through the fog, and for a brief moment I felt as though the whole city were holding its breath. Oxford, in its way, has always been complicit in its mysteries. When I finally entered the chapel, the choir's rehearsal had ended. The air smelled of candle wax and damp hymnals. A single cassock hung from a peg beside the organ loft, small, red, and damp along the hem. Someone had tried to dry it too near the radiator. I noticed a faint outline where the cross pendant had rested against the fabric, darker than the rest. Lewis would have missed it. He was good but not cursed with noticing. The choirmaster was waiting near the piano, hands folded as though in prayer. His eyes were bloodshot. He spoke softly about the boy William. 11. Bright, obedient, fond of riddles. They had sung Fauré's Requiem that night. The irony, I thought, was not lost on anyone. As he spoke, I found my gaze drawn to the open music sheets on the stand. The final page had been marked with a faint pencil note, a single word invisible. It could have been a lyric cue, or perhaps not. The handwriting was not the choirmaster's. A boy's, likely, small and neat, but not careless. I made no comment, not yet. One should never disturb the small ghosts of handwriting before they've had their chance to speak. Later, outside in the cloister, Lewis mentioned that the boy's bicycle had been found behind the porter's lodge, untouched. No signs of struggle, no footprints that hadn't already been blurred by rain. The porter, a stoic man of 60, swore that he'd seen the child leave through the main gate. Swore it the way people do when they wish it to be true. I've learned that disappearances in Oxford seldom begin at the moment someone vanishes. They begin long before, in silences, in glances exchanged during choir practice, in the quiet envy of children who sing too beautifully to belong. The choir had been preparing for the annual Founders' Concert. Pride and rivalry flourish even among the angelic. That evening I returned to the chapel alone. The air had cooled, and the candles had been extinguished. I stood where the boy must have stood, facing the organ loft, the echo of his small voice trapped somewhere between the stone and the stained glass. My mind began to turn not toward violence, but toward music. The word, invisible, lingered. It was not a cry for help, I thought, but a message or a title, something composed. As I left, I paused at the door, looking once more toward the empty stalls. The mist had found its way inside now, curling between the pews. I thought of the hymn's refrain, "May we join the choir invisible," and wondered whether William had written it as prayer, prophecy, or invitation. It was not yet a crime, not quite. But Oxford has a way of turning the devout into suspects and the innocent into symbols. I lit a cigarette and watched the smoke drift upward, vanishing like a note held too long. The bells began again, slower this time, as though counting something other than the hour. There is something unnerving about Oxford when the choir stops singing. The silence does not return. Gradually it falls like dust, shaken from velvet, heavy and final. That morning I sat in the porter's lodge with a cup of tea that had long surrendered its heat, watching the rain turn the quadrangle into a mirror. It was the kind of day that seemed to mourn itself without needing a reason. Lewis arrived with the day's reports, his handwriting slanted with fatigue. Nothing new, he said, no sightings, no calls. He'd gone through the boys' school books, the dormitory drawers, the half-eaten apple on the windowsill, all ordinary, all pointless. He said it as though the child's absence were a temporary inconvenience, something that could be solved by patience and luck. I envied him for that. I remember looking at the umbrella stand beside the porter's desk. 6 umbrellas, all black except one. A child's, patterned with faded constellations. I asked the porter who it belonged to. He said he didn't know. He'd found it leaning against the gate after the rain 2 nights before. A small thing, easily forgotten, easily replaced. But the constellations Orion, Cassiopeia, Andromeda had been drawn not by the factory that made them, but by a hand that had traced them over again in faint pencil lines, reinforcing what time had worn away. I found that oddly moving. Children, after all, preserve the stars when adults forget to look up. The choirmaster, Mr. Dane, found me later in the cloister. He was pale, his voice thin as parchment. He'd come from a meeting with the dean, who was now willing, reluctantly, to allow police photographs in the chapel. I told him we would try to be discreet. He smiled, not from courtesy but exhaustion. He said the choir would not be singing that evening. The boys had grown restless, frightened. One had woken, screaming in the night, insisting he'd seen William standing in the courtyard, soaked to the bone, humming the requiem. Children's fear is not to be mocked, though adults often do so to avoid their own reflection in it. Later that afternoon, I walked through the music corridor, alone. The walls were lined with framed photographs of choirs of past decades, their faces solemn, unblinking. In one, a boy at the far right had his hand half raised, as though mid-motion. Something about that gesture caught my attention. When I stepped closer, I saw that it was the same small cross pendant that had left its mark on the cassock. The inscription barely visible beneath the glass, W.D. 1997, William Dane, the choirmaster's son. There are moments when deduction feels less like discovery and more like trespass. I said nothing to Lewis, not yet. There's no virtue in half-truths, but sometimes silence is the only mercy one can offer another man's ghost. Evening came quietly. The rain thinned to mist. I returned to the chapel once more, though I had no reason to. A recording of Fauré played faintly through the loudspeakers, the choirmaster's choice, perhaps to keep the silence from becoming unbearable. I sat in the back pew, watching the light from the organ loft flicker across the polished floor. The smell of incense lingered. I found myself tracing the pattern of the floor tiles with my shoe, black and white, alternating like the logic of a chessboard order, pretending to hold chaos in check. The thought amused me briefly. Then I noticed something small near the edge of the choir stalls. A slip of torn paper, curled and damp. I picked it up, expecting a hymn fragment, perhaps a note from one boy to another. But it was a crossword clue, torn from the Oxford Mail. The handwriting in the margin was unmistakably William's, small, neat, and quietly determined. Next to the clue, celestial body that vanishes yet guides the lost, he had written his answer, Polaris. I folded the scrap carefully into my coat pocket. The silence seemed to deepen around me, as though even the walls had drawn a breath. I thought then of the umbrella with its penciled stars, the word invisible written in his score, the quiet devotion of a boy who had known the constellations not as myths, but as companions. Whatever else had happened, I believed William had not vanished blindly. He had been following something, perhaps someone. Outside, the rain began again, soft but insistent. In Oxford, even the weather seems to know when a story is not yet ready to be told. She was already there when I entered the chapel, seated at the organ, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the keys, as though waiting for a permission she would never ask for. The sound she drew from that instrument was not music, but memory. It filled the air like candle smoke, lingering long after the notes themselves had faded. I did not speak at first. There are moments in life when silence feels closer to truth than any question could ever reach. I had expected her to be older, but grief, like devotion, distorts time. She asked if there was any news. I told her there wasn't. My words sounded mechanical, unworthy of the ache that passed across her face. She nodded, saying she hadn't really expected otherwise. She came here every morning, she said, before anyone else, to play, to listen, to remember. I asked what she played. She said it depended on the weather. Rain required back, sunshine demanded silence. Today, she said, was somewhere between both. It was she who mentioned the word invisible. She had found it in William's music book. She said he'd been obsessed with that word, in the last weeks writing it on scraps of paper, humming it under his breath. Once she'd asked him what he meant by it. He'd replied, not without a smile, that it was the name of a song he was composing, the choir invisible. He wanted it to sound as though no one were singing it, only listening. She told me he'd spent hours at this very organ, copying chords from the Requiem, adjusting them into patterns of his own. When she'd asked where he'd learned harmony, he'd said the stars had taught him. I found myself thinking of the umbrella again, of the constellations redrawn in pencil as a child's attempt to keep the sky from fading. Lewis came in briefly, carrying the photographs from the dean's office. He asked her if she might help identify a few of the boys in the older choir portraits. She agreed. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pointed to each face. When she reached the photograph of the 1997 choir, her husband's year, she stopped. "That boy," she whispered, "the one on the far right. He looks like my son." It was, of course, her husband. The resemblance was impossible to ignore, the same delicate features, the same fragile stillness, as if both had been tuned to the same quiet pitch of sorrow. When Lewis left, she turned to me and asked if I believed in echoes. "Not the kind that sound makes," she said, "but the kind that lives inside people, the ones passed down without consent." I told her I'd seen enough of them to suspect they exist. She smiled faintly. "I think William was his father's echo," she said. "A better one, perhaps." As she spoke, I noticed something glinting just beneath the pedal board, a small metallic object half hidden in the dust. I knelt and picked it up, a tuning fork, perfectly ordinary except for the faint inscription along the stem WD. It was cold, even though the air in the chapel was warm. I struck it gently against the wooden bench. The note rang clear, pure, and unsettlingly human. She listened without moving. "That's his," she said quietly. "He used to carry it everywhere, said it helped him find the right pitch when the organ was too proud to listen." I asked her if her husband knew. She said he didn't. Or perhaps he pretended not to. He'd been distant lately, restless. The rehearsals had grown tense. William had made mistakes that were not his own. And then one night she'd heard the boy crying in the vestry, begging someone not to tell. She'd gone to him, but by the time she reached the door, He'd stopped. We said little after that. She began to play again, something softer, without name or rhythm, and I felt, absurdly, that she was trying to speak through the keys. I stood there until the final chord dissolved into the rafters. Then I left her alone, as one leaves a prayer unfinished. Outside, the rain had stopped. The stones of the quad gleamed darkly under a fragile light. I still had the tuning fork in my pocket. When I pressed it lightly between my fingers, it vibrated faintly, almost imperceptibly, as though something unseen was still listening. I have often thought that Oxford is built entirely upon puzzles, its towers, its mines, its silences. That morning, even the rain seemed to fall in patterns, delicate as ink stains on old paper. I was seated in the small office allotted to me at the college, a cramped space smelling faintly of damp files and furniture polish. Lewis had gone to fetch tea. The sound of his shoes echoed down the corridor like punctuation in a long, hesitant sentence. I unfolded the newspaper from the day William disappeared. The crossword had half completed the same neat, deliberate handwriting I'd seen on the torn scrap found near the choir stalls. Polaris. I traced the word with my thumb, a boy who loved stars, who played music that pretended to be silent. I wondered what he had been trying to tell us. The clue before it read, "Symbol of faith found at a junction." The answer to 5 letters was left blank. I smiled despite myself. Faith, a junction, 5 letters, cross. Simple, literal, almost naive. But Morse never trusted simplicity. There was something unnerving about it. The boy had known both the word cross and the symbol it represented. He had worn one pressed so long against his cassock it had burned its outline into the fabric. Lewis returned with the tea, too sweet as always. He said the choirmaster had asked to see me. I told him I'd be alone shortly. He hovered at the door, reluctant to leave. There was something on his mind, there always was. I told him to say it. He said it was probably nothing, but one of the boys had mentioned hearing someone in the chapel after hours, playing the organ softly. Said he thought it was the boy's mother. I told him to let the rumour rest for now. Oxford feeds on whispers if one listens too soon. The truth gets drowned. When he left, I stared again at the crossword. Faith at a junction. They cross a meeting of opposites, a point where directions cancel one another out, death and salvation occupying the same line. It was a thought too theological for my taste, yet in Oxford, theology clings to everything like ivy. At noon I went to the chapel. The door was unlocked. A faint draught stirred the hymnals. On the altar, someone had placed a small brass cross, one I hadn't seen before. Not the ornate kind belonging to the college, but simple, handmade. Its base had been repaired with a piece of string. I leaned closer and noticed something curious along the back. Barely visible was a smudge of graphite. Pencil lead. I touched it with my finger and saw that it marked, faintly, like the residue left by a crossword clue erased and written over again. The organ pipes above loomed like sentinels. I imagined William here, the tuning fork in his pocket, pencil in hand, sketching constellations not on paper but in sound, a child translating the stars into chords. I closed my eyes and could almost hear him the way he might have played, the word invisible until it became real. Mr. Dane entered without a sound. He said the college wanted to cancel the upcoming service. Too much attention, too much sorrow. I said perhaps sorrow deserved an audience. He didn't answer. His face was composed, but the fingers of his left hand twitched slightly, as if conducting some unheard rhythm. When he turned to leave, he said his son's music would have made them proud. The phrasing struck me. Past tense, unconscious, too revealing. I made a note of it only in my head. As he walked away, I noticed the faint dust on his cuffs, grey, powdery like chalk or plaster, and suddenly I remembered the crypt below the chapel had been undergoing restoration. The workmen had sealed the entrance weeks ago, only the choirmaster would still have the key. It was not conclusive yet, but deduction often begins as unease, not certainty. I ran my thumb over the pencil-marked cross once more. There, beneath the quiet beauty of faith, I could feel the restless pulse of guilt. Outside the bells began again. This time I counted them. 12, no, 13, one too many, and yet somehow perfectly in tune. There is a peculiar quiet that belongs only to empty schools. That morning I felt it settle over the choir room like a veil, the faint ticking of a wall clock, the ghost of a hymn, still breathing through the rafters, the heavy patience of wood and dust. Lewis was cataloguing music sheets, his large hands unsuited for such fragile paper. I watched him for a while before saying anything. Some people bring sound into silence, others seem to absorb it. He found the choir list tucked between hymnals in the third drawer, an old attendance sheet, the kind every choirmaster uses without thinking, each boy's name printed in black ink, followed by columns of ticks and crosses. William's line was the last. The final tick stopped the week before his disappearance. The week after was blank. I remember leaning closer, tracing the faint indentation of pencil marks where someone had erased something. The surface still carried the scars of writing an impression of letters, faint but decipherable under the light. I tilted the paper toward the window, and the word revealed itself like breath on glass. Present. Erased carefully. Not a simple omission. Someone had removed the record of the boy being there at all. Lewis thought it meaningless. He said it was probably a clerical correction, some harmless confusion of dates. I didn't answer. One learns in Oxford to distrust coincidences committed on paper. Documents, like people, are more honest when they've tried to lie. I asked where he'd found it exactly. He pointed to the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. I pulled it open again and found beneath a scatter of old programs a small envelope unsealed, yellowed. Inside were fragments of choir rosters from previous years, torn neatly into halves. I recognized the name Dane more than once, appearing and vanishing through the decades like a refrain. It struck me how the same families had sung in this choir for generations, each voice replacing the last as naturally as one shadow following another. The choirmaster came in then, unannounced, moving with that same restrained unease I'd seen before. He asked if we'd found anything useful. I told him only that we were reviewing attendance records. He smiled, though his eyes flicked briefly toward the drawer. His hand brushed the back of his neck, a gesture I'd begun to associate with him whenever truth came too near. He mentioned that the college planned a memorial service. He wanted to ensure the right names were included, the right hymns sung. His voice trembled slightly when he spoke of the requiem. I told him that in my experience memorials often arrived before their subjects were ready for them. He looked away then, and I saw the faintest tightening of his jaw. A man accustomed to controlling music, not emotion. After he left, I took the list to the window again. The ink seemed darker near the top, lighter near the end, as though written in 2 sessions, 2 moods. At the bottom of the page, below William's name, there was a note in smaller handwriting to be transferred. The words struck me with a chill I could not explain. Transfer to where? The boys sang only here. There was no second choir, no other chapel. I took the page with me to the porter's lodge. The porter, old and taciturn, had known every child who'd passed through these gates for 30 years. I asked if he remembered anything unusual the week before the boy's disappearance. He thought for a long time, the way men do when memory becomes work. Then he said, almost reluctantly, that the choirmaster had dismissed practice early one evening, the first time he'd ever done so. Said the boys had been tired, their voices off-key. He remembered because the bells had sounded before they usually did, echoing over an empty quad. When I returned to the chapel that night, I carried the choir list in my pocket. The building was locked, but the key turned easily enough. Inside, the air had grown colder. I walked to the front pew, unfolded the list, and laid it on the altar. The faint mark of the erased word present caught the candlelight like a wound reopening. It came to me then that the cross beside William's name in the earlier weeks was not the mark of absence, but of attendance. Someone had reversed the symbols. Presence had been recorded as absence, and absence as faithfulness. A small deceit, elegant and deliberate. The choir, it seemed, had been singing two songs at once, one for the world, and one only God could hear. And somewhere between them, a boy had slipped quietly out of tune. I have always believed that certain sounds carry memory. The human voice, when lifted in song, can outlive the body that bore it. That evening, as I sat in the chapel, the choir's absence felt heavier than any hymn could have been. The air still held their echoes, faint, uneven, as if the stones themselves were humming what they could remember. Lewis had gone home. He said there was little more we could do until morning. I envied his certainty in such boundaries. For me, the work rarely ended. It simply altered its shape, slipping quietly from evidence to thought. I stayed behind, a solitary figure, among pews still warm from the day's brief light. On the organ stand lay a sheaf of papers bound with twine, music scores arranged in no particular order. I thumbed through them idly, half expecting routine anthems, half hoping for something else. On the fourth page, the ink had faded to a pale brown. The title Psalm 131 had been crossed out and rewritten beneath. In smaller hand, Psalm 132:1-2, the fraction puzzled me. A psalm that did not exist, or perhaps one that had been invented to hide something real. The composition itself was crude, not a boy's nor a master's, but something in between. The notes moved unevenly, hesitantly, as though someone had tried to teach himself how to translate silence. At the bottom of the page, a signature WD again, but faintly beneath it, erased yet visible in the right light, another set of initials, JD, the choirmaster's. I looked around, half expecting the man himself to appear, his guilt bleeding into the air like incense. But there was only the distant sound of rain beginning against the stained glass. I lit a cigarette, careful to shield the smoke from the censers, and let my mind wander through the symmetry of those two initials, father and son, layered over one another like a palimpsest of intention and inheritance. There was something else. In the second verse of the psalm, if it could be called that, the words had been altered. My heart is not haughty, nor my eyes lofty, had been replaced with, my song is not heard, nor my voice lifted. A small change, but deliberate. It no longer spoke of humility before God, but of absence, a soul silenced by something unseen. It reminded me of the umbrella, of the penciled constellations, of the boy's peculiar fascination with invisibility. Each clue seemed to circle the same void, the act of erasure itself. The verger startled me when he entered, apologizing for the lateness of the hour. He asked if I had found what I was looking for. I told him I wasn't sure I'd know even if I had. He said that before the boy vanished, he'd often come here alone after practice to play from memory. Not from the hymnbook, but from something of his own making. The verger thought it was sweet, harmless. "Boys," he said, have their secrets. I asked whether the choirmaster had ever played with him. He hesitated, then nodded. Sometimes, he said. Late. The kind of late that means beyond forgiveness. When he left, I returned to the score. A small water stain spread across the lower staves, blurring the final line. I held it closer to the candlelight. What remained of the lyric read, "When the stars fall silent, I will remember their tune." It could have been childish sentiment, or something closer to prophecy. Outside, the bells struck 10, their sound folded through the mist, each toll overlapping the next, until the distinction between past and present dissolved. I imagined the boy standing here, the tuning fork in hand, waiting for the air to answer him. Perhaps he had composed this psalm for someone who refused to listen. Perhaps he had written it as farewell. When I finally rose to leave, I took the paper with me, though I knew I shouldn't. The chapel door closed softly behind me, and for a moment I thought I heard the faintest whisper of music follow a fragment too delicate for proof. I turned once in the dark courtyard. The windows glowed faintly from within, like eyes that had seen too much and chosen, mercifully, to forget. It was late when I found myself in the library again. The porter had long gone, and the sound of the rain against the arched windows had softened into something like breathing. I had not meant to return, but I have never trusted endings that come too quietly. There is always one drawer left unlocked, one candle left half-burned. The college library is not large, but it feels endless when one walks it alone. The smell of vellum and dust has a way of pressing close, like the scent of old hands. I switched on no lights. Instead, I took one of the chapel candles from my coat pocket, the kind that burns with a slow, deliberate flame, and placed it on the nearest reading desk. It flickered weakly at first, then steadied, throwing a thin golden circle across the surface of an open ledger. The book was the choir's archive register. Its pages ran back almost a century, each entry written in a script that changed with the decades, but never with the tone of obedience. I turned to the last few entries. William Dane entered neatly in the final line, followed by a notation that I hadn't seen before. 3 small symbols, a cross, a star, and what looked like a small circle, drawn in faint pencil. I traced them lightly with my thumb, trying to place their meaning. The cross was familiar, of course. The star is perhaps a child's decoration, but the circle felt deliberate, closed, unbroken. I began to suspect that it was not a symbol at all, but an omission disguised as one, the erased mark of an initial once belonging to another name. Footsteps sounded in the corridor behind me. Slow, unhurried, not furtive, the sound of someone who belonged. I did not move. The candlelight trembled slightly as the door opened. Mr. Dane stood there, his coat dark with rain. He looked not surprised to see me, only resigned. He said he couldn't sleep, that the storm had reminded him of old things. He had been sorting through his son's music, he said, and found something odd. A piece written in 2 hands, half his, half the boy's. He asked if I thought music could confess something a man would never say aloud. I told him confession required faith. He smiled faintly and said faith was the first thing to leave a house like his. He stepped closer to the desk, his eyes following the candle flame to the open ledger. He asked what I was reading. I told him the truth that I wasn't sure about yet. He said he had always admired my kind of patience, though it seemed a lonely virtue. While he spoke, I noticed his fingers tapping lightly against the wood, not random, but rhythmic. 4 beats, then a pause, then 3. I recognized the pattern. It was the same as the refrain of Psalm 132:1-2, the boy's composition. I waited until he stopped, and then I asked quietly if he had taught William that rhythm. He looked at me for a long time, as if deciding whether to lie. Then he said the boy had learned it on his own, that he had only listened. But listening, I thought, can sometimes be the cruelest form of complicity. The candle guttered, its flame bent toward him briefly, revealing the faint dust of plaster still caught under his nails, the same residue I had seen before. I imagined him in the crypt, the air thick and still, the sound of a tuning fork fading against stone. I imagined him standing behind his son, correcting a note that had never been wrong. He asked if I believed the dead could forgive the living. I said forgiveness was a form of hearing and that some ears remain closed, even in eternity. He didn't respond. He simply looked toward the high shelves, their rows of spines lined like witnesses, and said that William had once told him music was the only prayer that God never interrupted. When he left, I did not follow. The door closed with a sound too gentle to trust. I stayed there a long while, the candle burning lower, until wax began to pool like ivory tears across the desk. I copied the 3 symbols into my notebook, the cross, the star, the circle marks of faith, of heaven, of silence. Outside, the storm had quieted. I blew out the candle, and for an instant the smoke coiled upward in the shape of a question, unasked, unanswered, and still burning somewhere beyond sight. There is a peculiar cruelty in beauty, particularly when it insists on surviving tragedy. The morning after the storm, the sky above Oxford had cleared to an impossible blue, and the city went about its rituals as though nothing had been lost. Bells chimed, bicycles wove through narrow streets, and the river glittered beneath the bridges like a sheet of indifferent glass. I walked to the chapel slowly, my steps echoing against the flagstones. Every sound felt sharper than it ought to have been. Inside, preparations were underway for the memorial service. The choir stalls had been polished, candles arranged in neat symmetry, and a vase of lilies placed upon the altar. The scent was too strong, like the sweetness of something trying to conceal decay. Lewis stood near the organ, speaking to the verger. His expression, earnest and helpless, seemed to belong to another world, one where grief was tidy and facts were sufficient. He handed me a report from the forensics team. "Nothing unusual," he said. "No footprints, no foreign fibres, no fingerprints that shouldn't be there. The usual nothing that so often masquerades as a conclusion." I thanked him, though I hardly heard my own voice. My eyes drifted to the organ loft. The bench was empty now, the hymn sheet stacked neatly beside it. Yet the air seemed charged, as though a single, misplaced note might still be vibrating somewhere within the pipes. I found myself thinking again of the lost psalm, that strange fractional hymn William had written. Its melody had lingered in my mind for days, unresolved, like a question with no grammatical end. As the verger arranged the music for the evening service, a page fell loose and fluttered to the ground. I stopped to retrieve it. It was not part of the requiem, but a different composition entirely, one I recognized at once. Psalm 132:1-2, the boy's handwriting, though faint, was unmistakable. Someone had recopied it by hand. I asked the verger where he had found it. He said he hadn't left it on the piano that morning, unsigned. He thought it must have been part of the memorial program. But there, in the corner of the page, was a small annotation in pencil, a word, alibi. I slipped the sheet quietly into my coat pocket and walked toward the courtyard. The word gnawed at me with quiet persistence. Alibi, Latin for elsewhere. A place of safety by means of absence. Perhaps not a defence at all, but a confession of departure. The choir boys were gathering outside, their laughter brittle, too bright. They carried their hymn folders like shields. One of them, a slight, fair-haired boy, tugged at my sleeve. He said softly that William had once told them every song was a riddle if you listened properly, that some notes pointed somewhere. He didn't say where. It was then, standing among those children, that a detail I had dismissed days earlier began to stir. The cross beside William's name on the attendance sheet, the circle in the ledger, the erased word present, and now alibi. Together they formed not random symbols, but a kind of notation, a code written in absence, each mark replacing the voice of the boy who had been silenced. I left the chapel without a word. The air outside smelled faintly of damp. Earth and wax. Across the quad, Mr. Dane was speaking with the Dean. His posture was impeccable, his grief rehearsed. As I passed, he looked up, and for the briefest instant, our eyes met. He smiled politely, too politely, and I saw in that expression not sorrow, but recognition, as though he knew what music I had begun to hear beneath the silence. That night, back in my flat, I placed the copied psalm on the table beside a crossword I had abandoned earlier in the week. I noticed, by chance or design, that the clue I'd left unfinished read, "Sound of innocence, disguised as proof." The answer came easily now, alibi. I closed the paper, poured a small measure of whiskey, and let the darkness settle. Somewhere in Oxford, a choir was singing the Requiem, their voices rising into the vaults like questions that would never find their answer. I listened until the sound faded into nothing, and even then I wasn't certain the song had truly ended. There are sounds that do not belong to the living. They linger in rooms after their owners have left, suspended between echo and memory. That evening it was such a sound that drew me back to the college office, a faint, metallic whirring that should not have been there. Lewis had gone home again. He was better at sleeping than I was. I sat in the small office beside the chapel, the walls lined with hymnals and records of rehearsals dating back to the 70s. The choirmaster's desk stood open, drawers half emptied. On top lay a small, portable recorder, the sort used by musicians for practice. It was humming quietly, a red light pulsing at its corner like a heartbeat slowed by regret. I pressed play. At first, only static, soft, uneven, like rain brushing against a distant window. Then, faintly, a sound, a chord struck on the organ, not quite in tune. A pause, then a voice a boy's, uncertain but steady. He was reciting something under his breath, not words from scripture, but fragments of his own making. The phrases came disjointed, as though meant for no one's ear but his own. When the stars fall silent, I will follow their tune. When the gates close, I will sing through stone. Then another voice, older. The choirmaster's. The tone was gentle, but weighted with something that pretended to be patience. Again, he said, "Begin from the refrain." The boy obeyed. The notes wavered, then steadied. The organ joined him, the two voices human, an instrument entwined in uneasy harmony. And then, suddenly, a sound too sharp to be part of the music. A quick intake of breath, a shuffle, a faint metallic scrape. The recording cut out. I rewound it, listened again. The scrape bothered me. It was out of place, yet familiar. I thought of the tuning fork, of the small vibration it produced when struck. The sound was the same, but it came not from metal on wood, but from metal against stone. I searched the desk drawers, the cupboards, and the shelves. Behind a stack of choir folders, I found a box of old cassettes, unlabeled except one. Rehearsal Psalm 132:1-2. The handwriting was William's. I took it to the player, inserted it, pressed play. This time there was no organ, only the boy's voice, humming the melody softly, like someone afraid of being overheard. And beneath it, faint but persistent, another sound of water dripping, not rhythmic, but hollow, echoing. I closed my eyes, trying to place it. The chapel had no running water, nor did the vestry. But the crypt had been damp for years, the stones sweating with the weight of centuries. I paused the tape. The silence that followed felt dense, full of meaning it refused to release. My mind began to arrange what I knew. The plaster dust on Dane's cuffs, the erased attendance marks, the symbols in the ledger, the boy's fixation on sound. Every clue pointed downward, beneath the chapel, to the one place no one had looked since the restoration began. The key to the crypt hung on a peg near the vestry door. It was old brass, warm to the touch. I hesitated before taking it. There are certain thresholds a man crosses, knowing he will not return, unchanged. Still I went. The stairwell descended in narrow spirals. The air grew colder, thicker. My torch beam trembled across the stone walls, catching on damp streaks and forgotten tools. At the bottom lay a wooden door half-sealed with plaster. Someone had forced it open recently. The edge splintered, dust scattered. Inside, the smell hit the first mildew and earth, and something else faintly metallic. The beam swept across the crypt, revealing stacked hymn books, abandoned scaffolding, a single chair facing the far wall. And there, resting on the floor beside it, a small tape recorder identical to the one above. I crouched, pressed play. At first, nothing. Then a faint hum, the same chord, the same hesitant voice. Only this time, no accompaniment followed, just breathing. Then the sound of footsteps moving away. And finally, they scraped the same metallic stroke against stone, this time ending with a soft, resonant tone that lingered longer than it should have. I turned off the recorder. The air had grown utterly still. For a moment I thought I heard another sound, not from the tape, but from somewhere behind me. A sigh, perhaps, or a draught finding its way through the ancient cracks. I left the crypt without turning back. Some truths, I've learned, survive best in darkness. When I reached the surface, the night had deepened. The chapel bells struck midnight. Each chime seemed to carry that final tone from the tape, a single note that refused to die, echoing through Oxford like the memory of a voice still trying quietly to be heard. There comes a point in every investigation when what one discovers ceases to illuminate and begins, instead, to dim everything around it. That night, Oxford felt dimmed beyond reason. The streets were half drowned in fog, the lamps bleeding gold into the mist like dying thoughts. I walked back toward the college, though I could not have said why. The case, if that's what it still was, had grown quieter, as though it too had run out of breath. The chapel door was ajar. Inside only one candle burned, its flame barely surviving the draughts that curled through the stone ribs of the nave. The organ pipes loomed above like suspended questions, their mouths sealed. I stood for a moment listening. There is a silence that does not comfort one that feels conscious of being watched. Lewis found me there an hour later, or perhaps longer. His voice was subdued, his steps uncertain. He told me the restoration workers had reopened the crypt that morning. They'd found the tuning fork lodged in the stone near the east wall. He asked if I wanted to see it. I said no. Some objects, I told him, are more eloquent and unseen. He didn't argue. He handed me a report instead of the forensic analysis of the recording devices. One tape had been overwritten, fragments of one voice bleeding into another. The boys and the fathers, indistinguishable now, as if they had become a duet no one had intended to write. Lewis said he couldn't make sense of it. I told him neither could I, though that was not entirely true. Sense in Oxford is always a luxury of the uninvolved. After he left, I poured myself a whisky from the flask I kept in my pocket. The taste was rough, cheap, but it steadied me. I walked down the aisle to the altar. On it, beside the brass cross, Someone had left a piece of sheet music, the same psalm again, 132, 1-2. The handwriting was different this time, older, more deliberate. The signature at the bottom read J.D. The melody had been altered. The boy's simple phrasing was replaced with careful ornamentation, as though someone had attempted to refine what innocence had first conceived. But in doing so, they had destroyed its shape. The refrain that once reached upward now folded inward, each progression resolving too soon, as if afraid of its own echo. I thought then of something the choirmaster's wife had said, that William believed music should never end where it began, that each hymn should rise, falter, and vanish before it found peace. It struck me that her husband had done the opposite, turning assent into collapse, prayer into confession. The candles sputtered. I sat in the front pew, tracing with my eyes the grain of the wooden stall where William had once sat. The surface bore faint scratches, initials carved perhaps by restless hands, DWD several times over, and beside one, in smaller script, barely visible JD. They overlapped, almost deliberately. A father who could not bear his own echo, a boy who learned too perfectly the language of guilt. I closed my eyes, and in the darkness I heard again the voice from the tape, the soft hum, the repeated phrase. When the stars fall silent. It was no longer a child's lament. It had become a man's prayer, transcribed in another key. The next morning, the dean announced the choir would resume services. For the sake of the living, he'd said. The phrase amused me, as if music could distinguish between those who breathe and those who merely remain. I attended the rehearsal out of habit, more than duty. The choir sang with tentative grace, their voices weaving through the damp air. The new boy leading the treble line faltered on one note a high G, and the choirmaster corrected him with quiet precision. But in that momentary hesitation, I heard it again, the faint dissonance that had haunted the recording. A single note held too long, almost definitely. The sound of someone remembering when they were told to forget. When the hymn ended, the choirmaster looked at me from across the nave. There was no accusation in his eyes, only exhaustion. He nodded once, the gesture of a man who has accepted his own sentence. I returned the nod. Nothing further passed between us. As I left the chapel, I paused at the doorway. The morning light was seeping through the mist, turning the puddles in the courtyard to mirrors. Behind me, the choir began again, the same hymn, the same fragile ascent. Their voices rose, imperfect but brave. I stood there listening until the melody fractured against the roof, scattering like light on water. It was neither requiem nor absolution, something between both. The Canticle of Doubt, perhaps, sung for those who could never quite decide whether they were seeking forgiveness or merely an ending. And as I walked away, the bells began once more, 13 tolls, though there should have been 12. The extra note hung in the air like a question the city had learned to live with, a question that even now refuses to fade. Oxford is most itself in the hour before dawn. The mist presses close to the pavements, and the city seems to listen to its own silence, a fugue played on stone and shadow. I often walk at that time, long after the paperwork has been filed, and the headlines have lost their appetite for tragedy. There is always one case, though, that stays behind, humming faintly beneath the noise of the others. This was that one. The Dane family left Oxford within a week. Quietly, as such departures always are. No statement, no ceremony, just a removal van at dawn and a drawn curtain by midday. The chapel reopened, and the choir resumed their rehearsals. I heard they sang Foray again, as if circling the wound until it ceased to ache. People need to believe in continuity. Even the guilty. Lewis stopped by my flat a few nights later. He'd brought fish and chips wrapped in yesterday's news, the kind gesture of a man who understood that conversation was sometimes better left to vinegar and silence. He asked if I'd been sleeping. I said I'd tried. He didn't believe me. He said the coroner had ruled the matter accidental, a tragic fall in the crypt, nothing more. The college, he added, was content with that. Oxford, after all, prefers its ghosts to remain unnamed. When he left, I poured myself a small whisky and sat by the window. The radio was playing something faintly orchestral, a minor key that drifted between melancholy and peace. It reminded me of the boy's composition, the lost psalm, the fractured hymn. I took the score from my desk drawer and spread it before me. The notes, even in their childish imperfection, carried a strange symmetry. The refrain rose, faltered, then climbed again, the sound of persistence. A prayer without theology. I had once believed that justice, when achieved, left a kind of quiet behind it. I know better now. The truth rarely resolves like a chord. It hangs, suspended, waiting for a listener who will never arrive. There was one detail that had continued to trouble me, a small thing, almost irrelevant. The extra chime from the chapel bells that morning, 13 strokes. Lewis had laughed when I'd mentioned it. Faulty mechanism, he'd said, probably moisture in the wires, perhaps. But I had walked past the bell tower that evening, long after the rain had stopped. The ropes were dry, the mechanism silent. Yet the bell had rung once more, unbidden, one clear, solitary note. I sometimes think William's psalm was never meant to be sung aloud. Perhaps it was a map, a way of marking the distance between faith and understanding, between what is known and what must remain unsaid. His father, I suspect, mistook that silence for defiance. The kind of error men make when they can no longer hear the difference between devotion and guilt. The final page of the score ends abruptly. The last line trails off mid-measure, as though the hand that wrote it had been called away. I traced it with my thumb, half expecting to feel warmth there. Instead, only the faint indent of pencil, and beneath it, almost invisible, 2 words hold rest. A musical direction, perhaps, or an instruction of another kind, to pause, to let the sound fade rather than force its end. Outside, the bells began again at 12 this time, correct and measured. The sound carried across the rooftops, through the rain-darkened air. And for a moment, I thought I heard another voice rising faintly behind it, somewhere between harmony and memory. The echo of a child's refrain, unfinished yet complete. I closed the window and let the sound fade into stillness. The candle on my desk guttered, its flame thinning into smoke. I watched it curl upward, dissolving into nothing, and thought not for the first time that perhaps all investigations end this way. Not in revelation, but in diminuendo. I sat there until the last trace of light had gone, and then, without meaning to, I whispered the words he'd once written when the stars fell silent, and somewhere in the city, as if to answer, a single bell rang out soft, imperfect, and terribly human.